di University of Washington dengan judul tesis Present and Cycle ya. Kalau diterjemahkan ke Indonesia, Bulan Sabit dan Palu Arit ya, Islam and Communism in the Northeast Indies in 1915 in 27, dan Bachelor of Arts First Class Honor di National University of Singapore dengan tesis berjudul Islam and the English Cosmopolitan Vernacular, a study of English language Sufi devotional literature. Jadi secara garis besar
Mas Rian. Oh no, I think Mas Rian has dropped from the... Mas Reza, do you want to step in, or shall we wait for Mas Rian?
Hello, I'm Paricha. Maybe there is technical issues with...
I'm sorry.
Okay, he's back now. Hello, Pak Rian.
My signal is lost. Oke, jadi Lin di sini will be presentation about the collaboration in Marxism and Muslim in period of revolution in Indonesia, circa 1945 sampai 50 ya. Jadi dari tahun 1945 sampai tahun 1950. Maybe the time is yours, Lin. You can start your presentation.
Okay, Mas Rian, thank you so much for the introduction. It's very kind of you. Saudara-saudari, saya sangat bersyukur untuk kesempatan ini. Tapi saya harus minta maaf, bahasa Indonesia saya belum lancar untuk memberikan ceramah akademik di bahasa Indonesia. Jadi saya harus pakai bahasa Inggris. Saya harus minta maaf. I think we will continue with the presentation. So just give me a second to share my screen, put my slides up. Okay. Jelas ya? Bisa lihat? Okay. Thank you, Mas Rian. Okay. Jadi, let me pull up my script. Okay. Before we begin today, I just want to be very clear. In the light of recent legislation in Indonesia, I understand that there are legal ramifications for talking about and writing about Marxism in Indonesia. I want to be very clear here, right at the beginning of this talk, that I am not advocating that anyone become a Marxist. I am not advocating that anyone go and join a communist party or found a communist party. All I'm simply doing here is talking about Indonesian history. And I have plenty of evidence to support the arguments that I will be making and the interpretations that I will be making. We can disagree, we can debate over how fair those interpretations are, but nevertheless, I think the existence of my material is beyond question, and in a sense is simply a fact of Indonesian history. Whether we want to engage with it is up to us, but nevertheless it exists, right? So I want to be clear that this is about Indonesian history, Sejarah Indonesia. This is not advocacy, right? This is not a political talk. Not fundamentally, this is historical talk. So I think what I'm really trying to do here with this presentation is to try and present a new perspective on the Revolusi Kemerdekaan, right, the Indonesian Revolution. And we know about the Indonesian Revolution from many different perspectives, right? We have excellent work from so many scholars. Maybe the most famous one is Benedict Anderson, his 1972 monograph, Java in the Time of Revolution. Still very fun read. I enjoy it very much. If you're interested in the revolution, you should certainly read it. There are similarly interesting monographs on the Indonesian Revolution by so many different people. Mestika Z is one that comes to mind. Tapi juga Robert Cribb, right, who's Gangsters and Revolutionaries, about the preman in the Indonesian Revolution, has always been a favorite of mine. Mary Steedley presents a story of the Indonesian Revolution from the periphery, if you like, similar to John Smail, but she talks about women and their experiences and of the Karo Batak in Sumatra. And so there are many ways to think about and understand the Indonesian Revolution. There are many angles, but I think the one that I want to bring to the table today, the one that I want to talk about today, and hopefully will be interesting to everyone here, is to think about the Indonesian Revolution as this special moment where Muslims and Marxists could cooperate. And indeed, the boundary between Muslim and Marxist was very porous, very permeable, very unclear. So that's really what I'm going to be focusing on today. Now, as you can see, these are the 4 things I want to get through today. I'm going to be looking at a bunch of newspapers that were associated with Tan Malaka's Persatuan Perjuangan. I'm also going to be looking at a newspaper called Suara Buruh that's associated with the PBE, the Partai Buruh Indonesia, also the Barisan Buruh Indonesia, the BBE, which was controlled primarily by SK Trimurti, and also the writings and thoughts of her husband, Sayuti Melik. So primarily, I'll be focusing on Suara Buruh for the second section, thinking about labor activists who were themselves Muslim, but saw utility in Marxist ideas. Didn't necessarily mean that they joined the Communist Party. In fact, most of them didn't. Some of them really didn't like the PKI. But they saw the value in Marxist ideas and Marxist analytical categories to understanding the situation that Indonesia was in, and to develop models for Indonesia to build towards in the future. Thirdly, we will move on to Hamka, who has a very unknown book, actually, called Revolusi Agama. And recent biographies of Hamka, like that by James Rush, and also by Khairuddin Al-Junid, don't really engage with this particular work of Hamka. And this work of Hamka is very interesting because he takes a completely different perspective from the kinds of arguments he will be making in the 1950s during the parliamentary democracy or the liberal democracy period. And finally, we will look at a short pamphlet written by Abdul Manaf. But Abdul Manaf, in this case, I cannot with 100% certainty confirm that this is Ahmad Subarjo, the foreign minister of Indonesia, but I am quite sure that it is, reading it in context with the rest of his work. So we will be looking at a small pamphlet that Abdul Manaf wrote, or Ahmad Subarjo wrote, called Faham Islamisme dan Komunisme during the revolution itself in 1946. And these all provide very interesting perspectives from the top to the bottom of Republican society, if you like, of Indonesian Republican spectrum. Yeah, from people at the very top, like Ahmad Subarjo, Hamka, very prominent people, down to journalists who are writing for Persatuan Perjuangan newspapers, right? People of, in a sense, no special, position or standing, and the kinds of ideas that they had about Islam and Marxism during the revolution. Okay, I am on a tight schedule, so I have to move ahead. Let's begin with Tan Malaka's Persatuan Perjuangan. So, we're looking at 2 newspapers here today. The first one is Suara Merdeka. The second one is Kedaulatan Rakyat. Yeah. So certain newspapers were known to be highly sympathetic to Tan Malaka's Persatuan Perjuangan, and they can be analyzed for the general tenor or the tone, if you like, of Persatuan Perjuangan ideas and discourse. At the very least, newspapers such as these serve as a kind of rough barometer for the ideas that were circulating amongst the political opposition, which is to say, those aligned with Tan Malaka, and anti-diplomacy, anti-negotiations with the Dutch during Sharir and then Amir's governments, which lasted from November 1945 to January 1948. And that's, of course, most of the Indonesian Revolution. So very briefly, as I'm sure many of you know, but just in case anyone doesn't, the 2 main alignments during the during the revolutionary period were Sharir and Amir's Partai Sosialis governments, right? And sometimes gathered in a coalition called Front Demokrasi Rakyat. That was one side, and the other side was Tan Malaka's supporters, usually called the Benteng Republik or the Persatuan Perjuangan, and that was anti-diplomacy. Sharir and Amir were interested in diplomacy with the Dutch as a means to getting independence. Tan Malaka and his supporters generally believed in rejecting negotiations with the Dutch. They called it 100% Merdeka, 100% freedom. And those were the 2 main political alignments of the revolution. So they had various names: Benteng Republik, Persatuan Perjuangan, Gerakan Revolusi Rakyat, right, at different times. Okay, but these are the 2 main factions. There were Muslims in both factions. There were Muslim parties in both factions. So there is no clear religious divide or even political divide, because both sides were also very Marxist and very kekirian during this period. Okay, so when we look at Suara Merdeka, right, which ran from 1945 to 47, it was very close to the Persatuan Perjuangan. It consistently supported labor unions and consistently endorsed socialism. So some articles, for example, performed a sort of didactic or pedagogical function of explaining, sort of basic political concepts, right? This included Hosso's social contract, and it was explained in simple terms, and it focused on the role that organized labor, so unions, right, had to play in an unspoken social contract. It explained the importance of the right to strike and argued that organized labor would function as a defense against the rise of dictators such as Napoleon or Hitler, right? So labor and organized labor in particular as a guarantor of democracy, right? These are the kinds of lessons that Suara Merdeka is trying to teach its readers. Such articles serve to legitimize the many strikes that occurred on government-run plantations and mines during the revolution. And these strikes were born of genuine hardship because people were really poor and they were really starving. And these were perfectly legal strikes, but these strikes were often suppressed by the government itself because the Republic was in dire financial straits. Other articles in Suara Merdeka proclaimed that, quote, democracy and socialism are the foundations of the Indonesian state, unquote, and also that, quote, the Indonesian working class, kaum buruh, condemns capitalism and calls for the establishment of a government based on socialist values, unquote. So at the same time, Suara Merdeka also published articles which openly embraced the revolutionary rule of Islam, such as one article contributed by the Dakwah section of Masyumi's Priangan branch. This particular article was very exhortative and very rhetorical. It framed resistance to the Dutch in specifically Islamic terms. It called on all Republicans to, quote, put your faith in Allah, who will deliver victory unto us, end quote. Islamic identity and socialist politics could and did coexist on the same page within the context of revolutionary solidarity. With the common enemy of the Dutch, it was really very normal for both Muslims and Marxists to work with each other and to say, we are on the same side, we are working towards the same goals. More explicitly, Suara Merdeka sometimes espoused solidarity with Marxist movements, both domestic and foreign, alongside expressions of solidarity with Islamic organizations. So that solidarity extends both to domestic and foreign Marxists, but also to Muslims, both domestic and foreign. So it would publish these articles explaining that, Australian labor unions were supporting Indonesian independence, while other articles, proclaimed solidarity with dock workers, stevedores, who were on strike in Singapore. So it really saw itself as part of, and its readers as part of this global labor movement. It also republished articles from Pravda, and for those of you who know, that is the official newspaper of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, which frankly is very propagandistic and not very objective. But nevertheless, Pravda was a source of news for Suara Merdeka. And one of the articles that it published from Pravda, translated and republished from Pravda rather, was condemning European attempts to reassert control over former colonies, whether that was the British, whether that was the Dutch, whether that was the French. So articles like these were published alongside other articles which, celebrated, right, Islamic achievements. And one of those articles was an article which celebrated the formation in Garut, in Jawa Barat, of an Islamic laskar called the Barisan Mujahidin, right? And so Suara Merdeka hailed them for, quote, defending religion and strengthening the republic, end quote. Suara Merdeka even published contributions from the Priangan branch of Masyumi, which I mentioned earlier, which called for solidarity across the international working class. So Masyumi members are publishing articles in a labor leftist newspaper, right, calling for solidarity across the international working class, and specifically advocating the, quote, establishment of a socialist state, unquote. So that is not how most people think of Masyumi. But if you look at the work of, say, Jaime Madinier, the French academic who studied Masyumi, if you look at the work of Kevin Fogg, you will see similar kinds of sentiments being put out by some Masyumi members. Masyumi is a very big party, just like Nahdlatul Ulama, Muhammadiyah today. They have a spectrum of different political beliefs, but there were parts of Masyumi that were very leftist and very showed a lot of solidarity with the international working class movement. So this last article by Masyumi's Priangan branch is particularly interesting because it also told its readers to, quote, trust in Allah to assure victory. And then it provided all these encouraging quotations from the Quran and also various hadith presented in both Arabic and Indonesian. So you really get a sense that Suara Merdeka's audience was conceived of as both Ummah and proletariat, which is the title of my upcoming book. And it drew inspiration from both the international world of working class solidarity, but also the international world of Muslim solidarity. So in 1947, a flood destroyed the original press, the printing press for the newspaper. And so Suara Merdeka split into two newspapers. One was Suara Merdeka and the other was Perjuangan Kita. After the flood, Suara Merdeka became a kind of daily broadsheet, so a daily newspaper, which was more factual and less politically partisan. It carried reports from international wire agencies like the Associated Press, as well as Antara, and it provided strong coverage of global events. So recurring topics in Suara Merdeka included USA-USSR relations during the early Cold War, anti-colonial movements in India and in Burma, now Myanmar, as well as the ongoing Chinese Civil War and the Greek Civil War. But even after 1947, Suara Merdeka still had this very clear pro-labor orientation, while always expressing solidarity with Indonesia's Muslim Republicans. So one article in Suara Merdeka from the post-1947 period talks about the formation of the Central Organisasi Koperasi Rakyat Indonesia, or SOKRI, which is one of the big union, it's not a union, but a federation of unions, right? And it explained that SOKRI would help create more peasant cooperatives across Indonesia, which it thought was a very good thing. Now, throughout 1947, nearly every issue would include one or two articles on the gains made by labor movements across the world, while the coverage of the newly founded International Labour Organization, the ILO, and its early attempts to codify fair labor practices was always celebrated by Suara Merdeka as well. Now, at the same time, Suara Merdeka also celebrated the achievements of Islamic organizations such as Muhammadiyah's Perserikatan Umat Indonesia, which it celebrated for creating new Islamic schools, new madrasas in the Bandung area. So Suara Merdeka's continued Marxist sympathies, you really see this in all kinds of different areas, right? International, domestic. It even extended to shall we say, we would call them Tapol now, but they were ex-Digul detainees at the time. So in 1947, Suara Merdeka published an article titled Rombongan Penghabisan dari Digul, which celebrated the return of the last batch, the final batch of Partindo and PKI Tapol from Bovendigul, so former political prisoners who were incarcerated by the Dutch on a penal colony. And most of them had spent the Second World War in Australia, right? So Suara Merdeka hailed them for, quote, lending their strength to the Republic, end quote. Suara Merdeka's visibly international perspective made it clear to its readers that the Indonesian proletariat were not alone. Right? They were supported by the Australians, they were supported by the Indians, they were supported by the Burmese, they were supported by Singaporeans, and they conceived of the Indonesian proletariat as part of a broader world of proletarian solidarity, which included actors as diverse as the French Communist Party or former PKI Digulist internees. So this world, this imagined community, if you like, right, it coexisted alongside and overlapped with the Indonesian national community. Right? And this was an imagined community that was expansive enough, that was broad enough to accommodate Muslim Republicans as comrades in the revolutionary struggle. So, moving on to Kedaulatan Rakyat. Kedaulatan Rakyat was published in Jogja from late 1945 onward. Rudolf Mrazek has described Kedaulatan Rakyat as very supportive of Tamalaka, and it regularly ran advertisements on Tamalaka's new publications, right? So, for example, in December 45, Kedaulatan Rakyat had a big advertisement advertising Tamalaka's new brochure, Politik, right? And many of his other works as well. Now, in Kedaulatan Rakyat, articles on the benefits of socialism in the Soviet Union were juxtaposed against contributions by Masyumi branches, again. And articles by Masyumi branches, they wrote things like, quote, we pray that Allah will unite us in our resolve to achieve independence, end quote. So on the one hand, they're talking about the benefits of socialism in the Soviet Union. On the other hand, they are publishing articles by Masyumi which invoke the blessings of God on the revolutionaries. So this newspaper conceived of its audience as a global proletarian movement. It didn't just republish work from Pravda, it also republished newspaper articles from the British communist newspaper, The Daily Worker, which was supporting striking unions in the UK, and it also celebrated the Chinese Communist Party's military successes in the Chinese Civil War. At the same time, it also often addressed Muslim readers directly. One article from October 15, 1945, exhorted Muslims to take up arms against the Dutch in explicitly religious terms. And they wrote that they, quote, prayed to Allah to guarantee the independence of Indonesia, end quote. Now, such articles shared the same space on this daily newspaper over and over again, over a period of many years, with no apparent discomfort or discordance. The revolution, I would argue, provided a kind of discursive space in which Islam and Marxism were not assumed to be enemies, despite the fact that there were many Muslim critiques of Marxism before 1945. That is undeniable, right? But nevertheless, within the space of the revolution, there was a kind of suspension of animosity facilitated by the need for the Republicans to stick together. But it was only really possible at all because Pergerakan activists like Tan Malaka and many others had already been insisting on the compatibility of Islam and Marxism for 20 years at that point, right? Not just Tan Malaka, but Sukarno and many others as well. I don't have time to get into that today, but I have published on that before. You can easily look up my work. So now we move on to Sayuti Melik and Eska Trimurti. So they were a married couple. I think they got married in the mid-1930s, if I'm not mistaken. But they were both very famous in their own right. So even after Tan Malaka's death in 1949, his ideas about the necessity of reconciling Islam and Marxism continued to be represented by the Partai Morba. So we now turn to one of the Partai Morba's most prominent founding members, Sayuti Melik, who was simultaneously a devout Muslim, Sukarno loyalist, and he had served as Sukarno's private secretary and drafted the Proclamation of Independence in 1945. But he was also a former Digulist, Tapol and Digul. So he had really very impeccable nationalist credentials. Now, Sayuti Melik had a very fine Pergerakan pedigree, right, or silsila, if you like. He was a young man in Surakarta and Jogja in the 1920s. And while he was there, he studied under Kai Hajar Dewantoro of Taman Siswa, as well as Kai Hajar Dewantoro's close associate, the Dutch teacher H.A. Zurink. So these sympathies were, of course, known to the secret police, the ARD, the Dutch police, and Zurink was eventually deported in 1924 for being a leftist sympathizer. Now, however, by that point, Zurink already had taught a lot of students, and many of Zurink's former students, including Sayuti Melik, were detained and interrogated by the Politieke Inlichtingendienst, the Political Intelligence Office of the Dutch police. So more important, however, was Sayuti Melik's connection to the late Islamic communist Haji Misbah. So late in life, Melik would reminisce that he had two teachers in the realm of politics. He said Zurink was his first teacher and Misbah was his second. Zurink had gotten Sayuti Melik interested in politics, which led him to read Haji Misbah's newspapers, Islam Bergerak and Medan Muslimin. And that in turn prompted him to seek out Haji Misbah and to become his student. So Sayuti Melik would recall later in life, he was very amused by this. He would recall later in his life that it was Haji Misbah who first introduced him to historical materialism. So Haji Misbah told Sayuti Melik that he must study Marxist historical materialism because it was very similar to Islamic teachings. Now, of course, Sayuti Melik didn't agree, but it was something that made him smile late in life. Shuttling between Surakarta and Yogyakarta, Sayuti Melik also studied Marxism with Darsono, Subakat, and Ali Arakam, who were some of the most prominent PKI leaders of the 1926 period, of the pre-1926 period. At the same time, he joined Muhammadiyah to deepen his understanding of Islam. So there's something poetic about Sayuti Melik's apprenticeship with Zurink and with Misbah, also in Muhammadiyah, as well as with the PKI. He kind of learned his anti-colonial resistance from both Europe and Indonesia. And he kind of symbolizes the two lineages, the two silsila, right, or two ijazah, or the two souls of the Pergerakan as a whole, right? Because Islam was always important to the Pergerakan, but Marxism was always very important to the Pergerakan as well. And this is really not surprising if we look at his family background. Sayuti Melik's father was a minor civil servant in the Inlandsbestur, the native civil service, but his family was devoutly Muslim, and many of his uncles were ulama. So really, more than anyone else, I think it is Sayuti Melik who embodies the eclecticism of the pre-1926 Pergerakan intellectual tradition and carries it forward into the Indonesian Revolution. Okay, so enough background, enough background about Sayuti Melik. I think we can jump ahead to say that his first contact with Tan Malaka was in 1926 when he read a samizdat, a sort of underground copy of Tan Malaka's Nardi Republik Indonesia. And given his close association with so many communists and reading communist books, of course, he was arrested and exiled to Digul in 1927. He only got out in 1933. And at that point, he was only 25, so he's still a very young man. But he was, because of his close association with he would continue to be involved with anti-colonial activism throughout the 1930s. He joined Gerindo, which was Amir Sharifuddin's anti-colonial organization. And of course, unsurprisingly, they got him arrested in 1936. And then he went to Singapore, where he got arrested again by the British police. But after his release, he married S.K. Trimurti. And S.K. Trimurti, like Sayuti Melik, was also a devout Muslim. And she was always clear about her Muslim faith. We know this because she wrote articles for Pergerakan newspapers like Sinar Selatan during the 1930s. And she was very clear that she was a believing Muslim. And unsurprisingly, just like her husband, she also got in trouble with the police and went to jail several times during the 1930s and 1940s. So by the time the revolution began, Sayuti Melik was already a hardened Pergerakan journalist. He was no stranger to suffering for his beliefs and his activism. And he had already been exposed to Marxist ideas for a long time. And he also had very good connections to the top tier of the Republican leadership. So it's probably not too surprising that he chose to support Tan Malaka, reject diplomacy, and joined the Gerakan Revolusi Rakyat and Tan Malaka supporters before eventually becoming a founding member of the Partai Morba in 1948. And the thing about Sayuti Melik is that when he was interviewed by Arif Priyadi in the 80s, he wrote about his revolutionary interviews in a very revolutionary experiences in a very religious tone. He actually, told Arif Priyadi that the revolution's success was never clear. He reminded Arif Priyadi, there was no guarantee that we would win, right? So each person had to choose the path which they thought would be best in order to win independence. He never blamed Shahrir and Amir for supporting diplomacy. He basically said, look, we have to choose according to our conscience and our best judgment, right? And so I quote from his interview with Arif Priyadi, Sayuti Melik said, "For only God can engender what does or does not happen in accordance with his divine power." Right? Very much a Muslim, very much accepting that not everything is in his control. He also explained that he did not join the PKI during the revolution because he thought that the PKI was not serious about Pancasila and only saw it as a means to unifying Indonesia. So in his words, the PKI's embrace of Pancasila was tactical rather than heartfelt. Right? The implication, of course, is that for a Marxist like Sayuti Melik, simply accommodating Islam was not good enough. Right? Guaranteeing freedom of religion was not good enough. For him, his belief in Islam as a Muslim was an integral part of his politics. And I think it's fair to say that there were many other people in the Partai Morba who believed similar things as well. So in the 1980s, when he gave that interview with Arif Priyadi, this book is really interesting. The interview was published as a book in 1984. And it was quite interesting because an entire chapter in this book is dedicated to Sayuti Melik's understanding of Marxism. So this provides a glimpse, right? Although admittedly refracted through decades of reminiscence and nostalgia, about the nuanced nature of Marxist discourse amongst Tan Malaka supporters. So we do have to read such sources with a certain amount of care, right? This is things that he's saying about the 1940s, but he's saying it in the 1980s, right? But I think there's at least two good reasons for why we should take it seriously. Now, the first is that you'd never ever call yourself a Marxist when Suharto is in power. That is a very bad idea. It creates all kinds of problems for you. But that is exactly what Sayuti Melik did. He refused to abandon his beliefs and he said, I'm a Muslim, but I'm also a Marxist, right? And he made this very clear in this interview. So I think we can safely assume that he's not joking, right? He runs a risk in saying these things, but he's doing it anyway. Also, we know that his early years in Solo and in Jogja, is the time he spent with Zuring, the time he spent with Haji Misbah, those years are easily verified. I haven't been able to verify that he was in direct contact with Semawan, Darsono, Subakat, Ali Arkam, but it is clear that he was in Surabaya, that he was in Solo, and that he was in Jogja, and he definitely spent time with Zuring, with Ki Hajar Dewantoro, and also with Haji Misbah. So I think we can safely assume that the things that he's saying in the 1980s to Arif Priyadi are very consistent in many ways with the beliefs he held as a young man. So he began by explaining in this chapter on Marxism in this interview, Sayuti Malik began by explaining the etymological roots of key Marxist terms like proletariat, like commune, but he was very focused actually on explaining the importance of Hegelian dialectical materialism and Marxist adaptation of that concept as historical materialism. So very theoretical, right? And I think if anyone reads it, you will see that he shows a very fluent grasp of Marxist theory, and he's very succinct in his explanation of how historical materialism shows the relationship between technological, structural, and economic developments, as well as the epistemological changes in human societies from age to age, rather than a kind of schematic unfolding of history that you see in sort of Soviet Union propaganda. So my point in bringing this up is that Sayuti Malik, he was never really somebody who took his instructions or allowed Moscow or Beijing to tell him what to think. He approached Marxism not as a dogma, not as a plan, but as an analytical tool. And he described it specifically as a form of ilmu pengetahuan, right, rather than some kind of plan or dogma. So he didn't approve, specifically in this interview, he was very clear. He didn't approve of the USSR, and he didn't approve of the PRC. He said that these were authoritarian states, and he said that they are having economic problems because they excessively rely on the so-called laws of dialectical materialism, and they do not pay sufficient attention to other factors, including the complexity of human motivations. Right? So he's very much a critique of the communist powers of the 1980s. Now, on a similar note, however, he also questioned the inevitability of the proletariat's revolt against capitalism. And he argued that a common understanding of revolution as a violent upheaval was simplistic, right? And that was focused on quantitative rather than qualitative or structural changes. He did accept that a socialist society would eventually prevail over capitalism, but not necessarily through the establishment of a dictatorship of the proletariat, which is Lenin's argument, right? And adapted by Mao, of course. So the following quip, I think, by Sayuti Malik, this little quote by him, really encapsulates his ideological flexibility and his complexity. So he said in this interview, if a callow youth, if a young man, is not attracted to Marxism after being exposed to it, his brains are frozen, otaknya beku, right? And if an educated and experienced adult thinks that Marxism is the best philosophy of all, this also signifies that his brains are frozen, right? So he calls for interpretation, he calls for context, he calls for careful examination of the ideas that Marx brings to the table without uncritically swallowing it. So it was this sort of fiercely non-conformist approach to Marxism that was supple enough to accommodate Sayuti Malik's Islamic beliefs. We know that many of Tamalaka's core supporters from the revolution, such as Muhammad Yamin, formerly of Gerindo, and Iwa Kusuma Sumantri, formerly of Partindo, were also pious Muslims. We can reasonably assume that Sayuti Malik's views on Islam and Marxism were echoed by many other Partai Murba members. So I think Tamalaka's supporters, though, were not the only Marxists who rejected the PKI and its identification with the international communist movement. There were many Muslims active in the labor movement who drew on Marxist critiques of capital, adapting these analytical frameworks to the dynamic political realities of a rapidly decolonizing Southeast Asia. So remarkably, I think many of the most vocal Marxists in the labor movement were women. And this is one of the things that I hope my book will contribute to the study of Indonesian history, because so much of the study of the Indonesian left and of Indonesian nationalism in general doesn't take enough account of the contributions of women. So the labor movement has been studied, very, very well. Excellent books by Ben White, by Jafar Surya Mongolo. But the women's roles in the labor movement haven't received much attention. So mostly, even when you do see them, you see them in the context of things like the Dapur Umum, right? Manning the communal kitchens that were so important for the TNI to continue the struggle, for the Laskars to continue the struggle against the Dutch. But really, there were so many women, like, for example, the PSAA, that's the Partai Syarikat Islam Indonesia, activist S. Yati, because she founded and led the Laskar Wanita Indonesia, right? The actual militia and actual Laskar during the revolution. Now, besides being combatants, these women were also participants in the production of political discourse. So through newspaper articles and pamphlets, they tried to shape the collective vision for post-war Indonesia, as well as to direct the course of the Republic's policies in the present. So this segment will examine the writings of various female labor activists from the BBI, the Barisan Buruh Indonesia, who were Muslims, but this Islamic faith did not prevent them from invoking Marxist ideas when they were debating what the Indonesian Republic should look like. So SK Trimurti was the key leader of the BBI during the revolution. This is just one of many Badan Perjuangan that were formed during the revolution. But she had actually begun as a journalist in the 1930s when she covered women's labor issues for various newspapers. She would also become a prominent leader of the Partai Buruh Indonesia, which was the party affiliate of the BBI in 1946. Now, the BBI was usually aligned and supporting Syahrir and Amir's Partai Sosialis, and it had been prominent in both the Sayap Kiri and the Front Demokrasi Rakyat. But during her time, sorry, I skipped ahead there. Trimurti actually became the labor minister in Amir Sharifuddin's second cabinet, and she was responsible for passing the Indonesian Republic's first labor law, which was extended to all of Indonesia in 1951. Now, there were several loopholes in this law, and not to mention implementation was difficult. If you look at the work of Rabi Faki, you see all the problems of implementation. But this law constituted the first comprehensive Indonesian law to protect workers' rights in general and the rights of female workers in particular. So it was a very significant achievement at the time. Now, Trimurti was, like her husband, a very independently minded Marxist. In fact, she even clashed with Musso very publicly when Musso came back to Madiun and argued for all the the Front Demokrasi Rakyat and BBI and all these other organizations. Musso argued that they should all join the PKI. Everything should be under the PKI, right? And Trimurti was one of the few people to stand up in public and to say no and to criticize Musso, right? And of course, Musso really did not like her for that. She was also a woman of conspicuous faith. Now, in September 1939, just before she was sent to jail again, she published an article in Pesat, in which she wrote very movingly about her faith. And she wrote, quote, "Our religion teaches us that all which God requires of us is for the good. What is now clear about this disaster, which is going to jail, is that the inner connection between my husband and I is based solely on holiness, and that foundation strengthens our prayers for our children," end quote. Right? Now, this religiosity, this commitment to Islam, is rarely, if ever, captured by academic studies of Trimurti, which tend to focus on her labor activism and her journalism. So Trimurti's commitment to Islam was very consistent. Even in the 1970s, she was still very clear about her religious commitments. Now, at the same time, she was deeply committed to socialism, and not just at an abstract level. She was always, as an activist and a journalist, very focused on workers' immediate welfare. So in an article published in 1946 in Kedaulatan Rakyat, the newspaper I talked about just now, Trimurti pointed out that the military ejection, the removal of the Japanese or the Dutch, would not be sufficient for independence. That is the minimalistic definition of independence, according to her. She said that the revolution would have to be systematized to guarantee social welfare, which could only be achieved through the expulsion of foreign capitalists and the nationalization of lucrative businesses like commodity plantations. And this, of course, is because even during the revolution and after the revolution, for many, many years, the Indonesian Republic continued to rely on the income provided by Dutch and British multinationals, particularly in the realm of tobacco, in petroleum, and in many other industries. So amidst the chaos of revolution, Trimurti also identified some of the structural problems of the Indonesian economy, which would turn out to be the main problems of the 1950s. So in another article in Kedaulatan Rakyat in October 1946, she condemned the Republic's reliance on Dutch businesses as sources of taxable revenue. And she argued that the prominence of the so-called orang particular, the white-collar employees of these Dutch firms, they had to be limited, they had to be controlled, or the Republic's economy would increasingly become capitalistic over time. Instead, she advocated the socialization of society as soon as possible. She saw the revolution as a global struggle against the creeping hegemony of capitalism, rather than just a nationalistic anti-Dutch phenomenon. In 1947, she wrote an article in Kedaulatan Rakyat celebrating SOBSI, right, for joining the World Federation of Trade Unions. And she wrote that it was, quote, a step towards the destruction of capitalism, end quote. So the focus on the immediate needs and suffering of the average laborer can be seen actually in a series of articles that were published in Pesat in September 1951. So this is a bit after the revolution, but the interviews that she did for this article was done during the revolution. Now, in these 4 articles, she wrote about the commodity plantations, primarily the tobacco plantations in Delhi, in South Sumatra. And she argued that these plantations, right, which were such an important source of revenue for the Indonesian state, actually continued all the exploitative labor practices of the old Dutch plantations, right? And these exploitative practices had been cemented by the client state, the Dutch client state called the Negara Sumatra Timur during the revolution. So she argued that the land rights of small cultivators, the land rights of small cultivators, right, were not being respected. The minimum wage for plantation employees was very low, was not a living wage, because it was determined by but it was set by the Dutch Association of Rubber Companies. And also that the sexual exploitation of female plantation laborers continued. And there were many women who were continued to be forced into becoming informal prostitutes or nyai, concubines, a practice which had long and deep roots in Dutch plantation capitalism. So of course, the argument she's making here is that we have fought for an independent Indonesia. We have won an independent Indonesia by 1951, but the horrific abuses under colonialism and capitalism are continuing. So the economic structures have to change. It is not sufficient simply to become independent politically. We have to reshape our economy to make sure that these terrible things do not continue to happen. Otherwise, what do we fight for? What do we die and bleed and lose so much for if we cannot change the lives of the average laborer working on a plantation? Okay, I am running out of time. I am going to skip a little bit forward here. So I think we can especially see Trimurti's sort of commitment to Marxism, right? When she argued for the specific needs and rights of female workers on 2 grounds. Now, first, she argued that the adaptation of Marxist ideas would help mobilize hitherto untapped support for the labor movement by bringing more women into the workforce and simultaneously freeing women from traditional gender roles as mothers, as wives, while amplifying the labor movement's influence. So to her, she felt that Marxism brought a toolkit of ideas, which meant that we could bring more women into the labor movement, where previously they were excluded, and I think John Ingleson's recent book on the labor movement in Indonesia really shows this. So much of the leadership of the labor movement was male, even though so many of the women were the ones doing the work, right? The leadership was almost entirely male in every major labor union. So Trimurti was one of the few who was speaking up, who was saying women need to be brought into the labor movement. Women are important contributors to the labor movement. Secondly, Trimurti also recognized that organizations would only possess that organizations would only be able to address the specific problems faced by female workers if women were included in labor union membership and leadership. So, okay, I want to make one final point because I'm running out of time and move on to the next section. I just want to draw your attention to the fact that when the SBAA, the Serikat Buruh Islam Indonesia, which was Masyumi's labor movement, labor union federation, when the SBAA was created in 1948, right, Trimurti was one of the very few Marxists to stand up and write in the newspaper and say that this is a good thing. The SBAA has a commitment to workers' rights. And she, in her words, I quote, SBAA is to be celebrated for building a labor organization based on Islamic principles, which would fight for the material rights of Indonesian workers, such that the will of God, who is sovereign over humanity, can direct humanity in the direction he pleases, end quote. She specifically wrote that this was a big improvement over the Syarikat Islam of the 1920s, which was insufficiently focused on labor and economic issues, according to her. And she praised Muslims for their newfound kesadaran, their awareness of labor issues. So for Trimurti, being a good Muslim necessarily involved struggling to guarantee the rights of workers and to improve the lives of ordinary workers in a tangible way. Regardless of whether you are a Muslim organization or whether you were a Marxist organization, if you benefit the lives of workers, that is what Trimurti was committed to. And she was willing to draw on both to achieve that goal, right? Okay, moving on from SK Trimurti, we look at a newspaper that was closely associated with the BBI and which Trimurti also occasionally published in. So we see this in Suara Buruh, right? Which was a very interesting newspaper and the main journalistic organ of the BBI, the Barisan Buruh Indonesia. It was first published as a monthly magazine in Jakarta in 1946, and it was openly sympathetic to communism, although the PKI had no formal influence over it, right? So it was not necessarily controlled by the PKI. It was deeply didactic, pedagogical in character, and it actually spent a lot of time explaining Marxist ideas and policies in a way that could be relevant to Indonesia. At the same time, a lot of his language also hinted at its journalists' Islamic frames of reference. So the BBI was very straightforwardly Marxist because it would advertise Indonesian translations of the Communist Manifesto. Doesn't get much clearer than that. And it also would run articles explaining the relationship between labor and capital, right? So very much teaching ordinary workers to understand labor relations, the Indonesian economy through a Marxist lens. But at the same time, it was also trumpeting an inclusive vision for Indonesian labor. There were many articles which argued that women's participation in the struggle for labor rights was essential, and it called women co-equal partners in the communist struggle. Also, interestingly, maybe because of Trimurti's influence in this organization, in the BBI, many of the journalists for this newspaper were women, such as Sri Yuliani. And this was very consistent, of course, with Trimurti herself as a female journalist. In 1946, December, Suara Buruh actually published SOPSI's manifesto, the PKI Union Federation. It published the SOPSI manifesto in its entirety, so it was really long, actually. And then it provided its own commentary on SOPSI's manifesto. So in the commentary, the editors of Suara Buruh proclaimed that SOPSI is constituted with no favor to any particular race, religion, or gender. Right? Very much supportive. Interestingly, some articles used religious analogies to make Marxism more easily comprehensible to the readers. In the February 1947 issue, Sri Yuliani was one of the contributors to Suara Buruh. She explained that Marxism was adaptive and flexible rather than dogmatic, and specifically, most importantly, that Marxism was open to interpretation based on the needs of the pergerakan. By way of analogy, she urged readers to consider how religion had evolved and been articulated differently in different times and places. And she said, just like religion has had different manifestations at different times and places, Marxism is the same. Just because Marxism looks one way in the Soviet Union or looks another way in China, doesn't mean that it has to look the same way in Indonesia. So this approach was very much consistent with the Partai Buruh Indonesia's public position. We see this from a 1948 pamphlet that Trimurti wrote called ABC Perjuangan Buruh, which was a very didactic Marxist text, which at the same time was very concerned to assuage religious beliefs. So without ever mentioning the PKI or the USSR, or the Soviet Union, this pamphlet provided a concise explanation of Marx's ideas about the recurrent crises of capitalism and argued that imperialism was a natural outgrowth of capitalism. Now, these explanations were followed by short quizzes, right? So it's kind of like a workbook, right? Where readers could complete a test to see whether they understood the concepts in the previous chapter. So very much, very, very educational kind of format. It also refuted the assumption made by so-called, quote, narrow-minded religious people, unquote, that socialist society was atheistic and therefore undesirable. As Trimurti put it, quote, every religion, every holy book, including the Gospels and the Quran, teaches humanity not to oppress one another, but instead to love one another. However, look at how social relations, pergaulan hidup manusia is the term she uses, look at how social relations are organized under capitalism. Oppression and exploitation are everywhere, and everything is objectified and reduced to its monetary value. Right? In contrast, Trimurti argued that, quote, every religion at its core harbors the essence, the sari-sari, of socialism, end quote. And since socialism regulated secular or material matters while guaranteeing the freedom of religion, religious citizens had nothing to fear from a socialist society. This was a significant departure, obviously, from the Soviet Union or the PKI. And in making such statements, Trimurti was echoing Cokroaminoto's, the 1920s Sarekat Islam leader. She was echoing Cokroaminoto's interpretation of socialism, which framed religious concerns as inextricably linked to the concerns of social justice. To put it in a nutshell, it's hard to be a good Muslim if you're not thinking about social justice. Okay, so we will move on from Suara Buruh on to Hamka's Revolusi Agama. Okay, so Hamka's Revolusi Agama was originally published in 1946, and a second edition was printed in 1949 during the final negotiations with the Dutch over the the Roundtable Conference. So it was a unmistakably patriotic, triumphal, and kind of optimistic book. There was a kind of ostensible revolutionary fervor to it, a very enthusiastic revolutionary fervor to his writing here, which may have kind of obscured, conveniently some of Hamka's maybe not so good political choices, because he had collaborated quite closely with the Japanese during the occupation. So here he's really like celebrating the Republic, right? I mean, it's a smart thing to do, but I'm sure he meant it as well. So the core of Hamka's argument was that the social revolution and the religious revolution had to go hand in hand, because religion and society were inextricably linked together. Now, to him, the forces unleashed by the Indonesian Revolution could only be consolidated and harnessed by proper religious praxis, shaping new institutions, new political cultures, new principles that would replace the old colonial norms. So equally, he recognized that religious praxis was usually a reflection of the social conditions of a society. So Hamka acknowledged that it was common in any society for the rich to oppress the poor, for a powerful country to oppress the weaker ones, while using religion and tradition to justify themselves. Now, he pointed out that those who sought to change the status quo or to reinterpret religion, you can think of this as a very kaum muda kind of mindset, right? They were condemned as provocateurs with no respect for tradition, not only by the beneficiaries of the status quo, but even by those who suffer under it, because everyone had been socialized to accept the normality of the status quo. So this is a very open-minded line of argument, which I would argue has more to do with sociologists like Emil Durkheim or Max Weber, rather than the classic Islamic discipline of tafsir, which is what Hamka was trained in. But his premise for Revolusi Agama was very simple, is that there existed a fundamental link between religion and society, and that one could not be corrected or improved without corresponding changes in the other, right? So religion and society go hand in hand. The Indonesian Revolution for him was a good example of how political changes had to be accompanied by religious and societal changes for a full promise of the revolution to come to fruition. So within that framework, Hamka embraced some very remarkable positions that would contradict his later emphasis on combating secularism and what he called nihilism during the 1950s. The revolution, I would argue, opened certain possibilities, right? Not just because the Republicans were very optimistic and happy, but because there was a genuine ideological ferment, a genuine ideological debate, as everybody sought to define the boundaries of the new republic. So in Revolusi Agama, Hamka wrote very approvingly of Ataturk, right? The founder of Kemalist Turkish Republic. And he argued that the Turkish national revolution had been politically secured by repelling the Greek invasion of Ionia and through the Treaty of Lausanne. But the political revolution was accompanied by a social revolution of eradicating obsolete thinking. He says, menghapuskan paham kolot, right? And specifically, he wrote about the abolition of the caliphate of Abdul Hamid II, the old Ottoman Caliphate, the adoption of the Latin script to increase literacy, so moving away from an Arabized script into a Latin script so more people could become literate, and also by limiting the formal influence of the ulama over politics, as well as freeing women from having to wear the hijab. And these were remarkably controversial issues to be talking about, even in the 1940s, and even today, of course, right? And it's really surprising that Hamka endorsed Ataturk and these changes in the Turkish Republic so wholeheartedly in this moment. So even more surprising, however, was Hamka's direct engagement with Marxist ideas in Revolusi Agama. In Hamka's original foreword to the 1946 edition, he quoted Marx, not to condemn Marx, but to approve Marx's beliefs that, quote, the guarantee of a people's freedom is a spirit of freedom, end quote. Now, we don't know exactly which text Hamka is quoting from here, but based on my research, I think he's paraphrasing Marx's 1844 book, The Wages of Labor. I don't have time to get into it. I will leave it at that. Hamka was perfectly willing to draw on Marx's insights, right, during the revolution. And this willingness was a reflection of the coexistence of Islamic identity and Marxist analytical insights, which had already been evident since the 1920s and the 1930s. You see it in the work of people like Hatta, you see it in the work of people like Sukarno, in Tamalaka, and Amir Sharifuddin. And I would argue this is part of a process of translating Europe to Indonesia. It is about taking the best ideas that the rest of the world has to offer and seeing how they can be made useful to Indonesia. So this was a particularly perceptible phenomenon during the 1920s and 30s, right? Especially amongst those who were more kaum muda, who were more leaning towards modernist Islam. So Hamka even went on to admit that many countries had historically used religion as a tool of oppression. Right? And he drew on the examples of pre-Reformation Europe, so 17th century France and 20th century Russia. And Hamka wrote about how Martin Luther, Voltaire, Rousseau, and Marx were, in his words, liberating heroes in these situations. Hamka also bemoaned that, quote, Allah's name, unquote, had been similarly abused to justify tyranny or kezaliman, and called for religious revolutions across the Islamic world, not just in Indonesia, to complement the political revolutions unleashed by the Second World War and decolonization. So what he's saying here is, yes, national independence is good, but we need a religious revolution to go along with the political revolution. So Hamka even went on to incorporate Marxism into his Islamic frame of reference, right? And there's a really interesting quote here because he argues that all atheistic and non-Muslim philosophers and intellectuals who came after the Prophet Muhammad, from Luther to Erasmus, from Spinoza to Schopenhauer, from Voltaire to Rousseau, from Tolstoy to Gandhi, even Hegel and Marx, were sent by God to perfect the interpretation of the great teachings of the Quran, menyempurnakan tafsir daripada ajaran besar Quran itu. So, I mean, it's a very striking claim, right, for an Islamic scholar to be making. So like many other pergerakan activists, Hamka, I think, was translating Europe to Indonesia here, like I said earlier. And his assumption, his basic premise, was that God works in mysterious ways. Even non-believers contribute towards the betterment of humanity in general, and the Ummah in particular. Okay, that's all the time we have for Hamka. I'm running out of time. I have about 10 minutes more. I'm going to move on to Abdul Manaf, or Ahmad Subarjo. So here we go. Oh, yes, I forgot to mention, you can see on the slide the my translation and also the original text of this particular quote from Hamka, which is very telling for him to say, kita pun sebagai kaum Marxis, right? For Hamka to be writing that in 1949. Anyway, we move on to Abdul Manaf, Faham Islamisme dan Komunisme. So you can read the quote on the slide by yourself. I will launch into my quick summary of Abdul Manaf. So Abdul Manaf, who was better known as Ahmad Subarjo, served as the Republic's first foreign minister from September 45 to November 45 in Sukarno's presidential cabinet. Now, he had trained as a lawyer at Leiden University, and he had graduated with a Meester in de Rechten, Master of Laws degree in 1933, which was very rare for Indonesians at the time. And he was also a member of the Perhimpunan Indonesia during his time in the Netherlands. Excuse me. Now, this was the same organization that Hatta and Shahrir had led until their return to the Netherlands in 1932, and whose leadership was subsequently very influenced by communists. And for that, if you want to read up about that, you can read the work of Klaas Stoetje. There's a very good short monograph on it. So Abdul Manaf was from Aceh, and he was known to be a staunch Muslim. He represented the Egyptian branch of the Perhimpunan Indonesia at the meeting of the League Against Imperialism in February 1927, alongside Muhammad Hatta, who was representing the Perhimpunan Indonesia branch of the Netherlands, and also Samaun, who was representing Syarikat Rakyat. Now, as a long-standing pergerakan activist with a very strong Islamic beliefs, Abdul Manaf also had a strong track record of being willing to cooperate with Marxists. During the Japanese occupation, Rudolf Marizek writes that it was Abdul Manaf who had convinced Shahrir to lecture at the Japanese-sponsored Asrama Indonesia Merdeka, and he convinced Shahrir by telling him that the Indonesian pemuda were eager to understand socialism. So in 1946, Abdul Manaf published a short pamphlet titled Faham Islamisme dan Komunisme, which explicitly aimed to so-called correct a misunderstanding common on the part of the masses, the rakyat jelata, especially among those who have little knowledge of religion, that communism is a specter or a ghost to be feared. Now, Abdul Manaf's argument was that capitalism and imperialism were intertwined. Capitalism sought to eat or ingest the wealth of the world, which imperialism had made available to capitalists through subjugating colonies and extracting both labor and material cheaply from the colonies. So putting these Marxist insights, very standard classical Leninist ideas, right, within an Islamic idiom, Abdul Manaf maintained that capitalism transcended races and nations, right? And he argued that it wasn't that the Dutch were particularly cruel, right, as colonizers in comparison to the British or the French or the Japanese. Rather, it was the system of capitalism itself that incited the hawa nafsu, right, of self-interest, ankara is the term he uses, with no regard for whether those who are being exploited are the same race, right, or a different race entirely. Capitalism, according to Abdul Manaf, had the defining characteristic of being willing to suck anyone's blood, right? Penghisapan is the term he uses. Now, at the same time, he adapted Marxist terminology like proletariat, and he tended to use the term rakyat jelata to translate proletariat, which was quite a sort of broader understanding of the word. Proletariat is a very specific class category relating to the urban wage laborers, right? Abdul Manaf was also adapting some of these Marxist categories like proletariat and applying it just as Sukarno had done with Marhayan, just as Tamalaka had done with Murba, right? So Abdul Manaf signaled his own deep commitment to Islam by quoting from the Quran. I believe this is Surah 16, ayat 128, and he wrote, quote, "God is with those who fear him and those who do good. Refrain from helping those who do evil and cause enmity," end quote. So to Abdul Manaf, capitalism was un-Islamic because it was driven by hawa nafsu yang tidak terbatas, carnal desires which know no limits. He rhetorically wrote, what causes man, who is God's vice-regent, Khalifa, on earth, to become a destroyer of the world, much like an animal with no akal, with no rationality, right? Now, unsurprisingly, his answer to this question is the nafsu of capitalism and imperialism, because capitalists trample over the rights of people in search of profit for themselves. Now, we see here this nafsu-akal dichotomy, which is so central to Islam, that informed Indonesians' critique of capitalism and at the same time sat alongside Marxist ideas. So Abdul Manaf didn't really just dwell on broad Marxist critiques of impersonal economic forces, but also on the everyday effects of capitalism on individuals. So consistent with his emphasis on the akal nafsu dichotomy, he argued that capitalism, quote, caused the prices of necessities to continually soar, to continually increase, and people face increasing hardship. Because people are struggling even to feed themselves, they learn to be dishonest in all matters relating to their livelihoods, and much theft and violence comes from this. There are many men who have sold their good names to feed themselves, and many women who have lost their dignity to fill their stomachs, end quote. Right? So he's not just talking about the abstract, he's also talking about how these systems of organizing society are ultimately dehumanizing. They ultimately contradict religious teachings. So, running out of time. Okay, better wrap this up. So in the final pages of his pamphlet, Abdul Manaf was more explicit about Islam's relationship with communism. I quote here, "Islam and communism have similar understandings of imperialism and capitalism. Even so, there are those who consider Islam to be antithetical to communism. These people need to consider, if communism is opposed to capitalism and imperialism, how can Islam possibly be opposed to communism?" End quote. He also made clear the importance of human agency in making the world a better place, even as he acknowledged the importance of Muslim piety, right? And he writes, and you see the quote on the slide, "In the capitalist and imperialist world, justice is not for the weak, but it is monopolized by the strong. The oppressed should not ask for justice, not before they have a weapon in their hands to seize justice for themselves. Justice can be seen in the first rays of sunlight, in the dawn of socialism's victory throughout the world. Does not the Quran tell us that Allah does not change a man's situation if he does not want to change it himself?" Now, communism was valued as a modern incarnation of Islam, but simply because it was a system for organizing social relations that prioritized social justice. An equitable society, a just society, was one that facilitated harmonious social relations and a moral order that were integral to Islamic ethics. This concordance of values made it easy, especially during the era of decolonization, for Indonesian Republicans to see communists as allies and to see communism as a useful set of ideological tools, even if they were pious Muslims. Okay, and finally we come to the conclusion. The point that I'm trying to make here is that an entire generation of Republican leaders had come of age during the interwar years and were deeply influenced by Marxism without being dogmatic communists. They saw each other as comrades, even if they disagreed on important policies, such as whether or not to negotiate with the Dutch. They also embraced the idea that broad cooperation between Marxists and non-Marxists was possible and desirable, that genuine comradeship and cooperation set the tenor for the revolution. Only a very few Republicans like Musso of the PKI were principally obedient to the Comintern and to Moscow, who were willing to subordinate local interests to Moscow's instructions. Most of the Indonesian Republicans were not. It was within this atmosphere that Islam and Marxism could coexist and cooperate, sometimes even exist in a symbiotic relationship. Excuse me. So ultimately, in characterizing these religious socialists or these Marxist Republicans, Muslim Republicans, I have found comparative perspectives from other places and times useful. So Sabah Mahmood, for example, in a 2005 book, she writes about the women's mosque movement in Iran, which is a broader part of the so-called Islamic revival of the 1970s, right, which articulated an important insight about the relationship between religion and politics, which is to say religion and politics do not necessarily exist in separate realms, in line with the so-called private and public dichotomy of Jürgen Habermas. But more recently, a younger generation of scholars, such as Nur Shafir, working on the Ottoman Empire, have taken these insights from Sabah Mahmood and applied them to various contexts, like examining how the role of religion can operate, how religion can operate in an often irreligious Islamicate society like that of the Ottoman Empire. So Sabah Mahmood argued that Eurocentric notions of secularism is deliberately separating religion and politics, whereas the women she studied often understood their religious beliefs and their religious piety as fundamentally political. So I think the point I'm trying to make here, when I draw on the work of Sabah Mahmood and the work of Nur Shafir, is that just like the Muslim women of the 70s were able to develop and express new political subjectivities through Islamic piety, many Indonesian Muslims also understood their faith as political, but not in terms of what we think of as political Islam, which assumes the inappropriate intrusion of the private into the public. Religion is private, politics is public, they shouldn't be mixed. That is a very Eurocentric notion. In many ways, I would argue that the Indonesian Republicans I'm talking about here saw their political choices, their public political commitments, as shaped by their interior religious morality. And that doesn't constitute political Islam in the sense of Kartosuwiryo's Darul Islam, though that only a very small minority of Indonesian Republicans were attracted to the idea of a Negara Islam Indonesia, a sort of state religion, concretized state religion kind of arrangement, right? Many of them simply saw Islam as an important part of how they were able to make political decisions. So Islamic ethics informed their politics, and that didn't mean joining Kartosuwiryo and joining Darul Islam. So most Indonesian Muslims supported Republican political parties like Masyumi, the PSAA, the Partai Syarikat Islam Indonesia, or later Nahdlatul Ulama, after it became a political party in 1952. They understood Islamic piety to be central to their political choices, but their agenda didn't necessarily entail the creation of Islamic State to replace the Republic. Now, for activists such as Sayuti Melik, Trimurti, or Abdul Manaf, it was their humane and rational faith in Islam which compelled them to adapt the intellectual innovations of the West, including, but not limited to, the intellectual contributions of Marxists. More explicitly, large numbers of pious Muslim Indonesians also supported political parties that were strongly influenced by Marxist ideas. Sukarno himself was a self-proclaimed Marxist as well as a Muslim, and had been so for nearly 20 years at this point. For such people, their Islamic beliefs opened political subjectivities on the left of the political spectrum instead of closing doors, instead of foreclosing possibilities. Piety could be and was expressed in a plurality of different ways, whether that was in parliamentary debates, whether that was in backroom negotiations between politicians, whether that was in public speeches, or in journalistic articles and pamphlets. Right? Okay, so those are my main arguments. I hope they are relatively clear on this final slide. Thank you so much for bearing with me. I know I've taken up a bit more time than I should have, and I turn my time back to the moderator, Mas Rian. Thank you so much for being patient.
Okay, thank you, Lin. Yeah, you have a very interesting presentation here, and ya dari artikel yang kamu presentasikan, dari presentasi yang kamu presentasikan, mungkin maybe Indonesian is have a bad timing about the freedom of speech. Jadi di tahun 45 atau dari 50, you know very well ya, in the newspaper ya, semua orang bebas mengutarakan pendapatnya, baik itu Marxis ataupun Islam ya, bahwa bagaimanapun kita memiliki gagasan apapun untuk kemudian diungkapkan, diekspresikan dengan baik ya. Yang penting itu konteksnya adalah bagaimana kita melakukan upaya dekolonisasi dari Indonesia ya, dan bagaimana kita mengurangi pengaruh dari kolonialisasi berupa Belanda dari segi ekonomi, kemudian dari segi perburuan, ya, terutama SK Trimurti tadi yang kemudian menginginkan bahwa kita harus mandiri, mulai mengurangi ketergantungan dengan perusahaan-perusahaan Belanda. Dan yang paling menarik tadi kutipan-kutipan mungkin double identity, Marxist and Muslim ya, yang mungkin sekarang tidak ada di Indonesia. Jadi kita harus memilih salah satu, mau jadi kanan atau kiri. Tetapi in the 1950, in 550, jadi seluruh founding fathers kita atau para bapak negara kita itu hampir seluruhnya mempelajari Marxis ya. Ini merupakan suatu hal yang aneh gitu ketika kita mengetahui di akhir-akhir ini ada RUU KUHP yang kemudian memban kita atau melarang kita untuk belajar Marxis. Padahal kita tahu sendiri di presentasi yang dijelaskan oleh Lin, Marxis itu memiliki pengaruh yang sangat besar untuk menentukan arah bangsa kita setelah 1950. Jadi bagaimana gagasan-gagasan leftis atau gagasan-gagasan kiri itu berperan sangat penting dalam kebijakan kita melawan kolonialisme bangsa-bangsa Barat dan menentukan arah ideologi negara kita. Jadi mungkin itu presentasi yang sangat menarik, dan bagaimana kita tidak bisa boleh melupakan bahwa pengaruh Marxis itu sangat terasa hampir di seluruh para intelektual Indonesia di awal period ya, di tahun 45 hingga 50. Oke, buat teman-teman yang mau bertanya, you can ask directly to Lin in Indonesian. You can understand Indonesian, right, Lin?
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
saya pikir bisa, tapi if I need some translation, I will ask you for help.
Oke, I will. Oke, nggak apa-apa. Jadi teman-teman bisa menuliskan di kolom chat atau turn on your microphone and ask directly to Lin about our question about his presentation in this evening. Oke, silakan teman-teman kalau ada yang mau bertanya ataupun memberikan klarifikasi. Ada teman-teman? Ini ada dari Iza. Maybe you can just read in the meeting chat. Iza Sanya. Yeah. I think Muslims who fought for independence and battle over colonialism use Marxism as a tool rather than an ideology, as it is. Religion is rather deeper, embedded belief that a secular ideology like Marxism. By a tool, I mean to give an easy illustration of a similar concept of struggle against corrupt power, the colonialists, in secular talk, to also appeal to the Indonesian orders who were educated in the European system. While Marx called religion as a tool for the oppressor, I would call Marxism as a mere tool as well known when combined with religion, their pious proponents. Despite all that, I suspect that Muslims draw a strict line between Marxism and Islam, since both came from a different backgrounds of thought formation, and that Marxism did not appear out of social situation of a Muslim community. So what about this boundary? Was it also mentioned by the likes of Sayuti Melik, SK Trimurti, Aduk Manal, Hamka, Ortan Malaka. Jadi seperti apa batasan yang mereka berikan buat Marxism and Islam?
Itu pertanyaan yang sangat tajam ya. This is a really good question, and it's not easy to answer because it basically varies across many different people and many different times. So in my book, I cover the 1910s until the 1950s, actually until 1965, and you see significant variation across where that limit, that batasan is, right? For some people, it really is a genuinely held belief that Islam and Marxism are compatible. And I think if you look at the work of Shamsul Bakri, in particular on Haji Misbah, it's very clear that Haji Misbah really saw no problem between mixing the two. For him, there is no limit, there is no batasan. But I think he's unusual. Most of them are not like that. If you look, for example, at the work of Darsono, right? His early work in Sinar Hindia, in API, those early PKI newspapers from the 1920s, Darsono writes quite a bit about the relationship between Islam and communism directly. I think there's even a series of articles from the 1920s where, you know, it's a serialized Islam. I think it's called Islamisme dan Komunisme. And it take, you know, week after week, it just keeps continuing, right? And in that case, with Darsono, I will argue, as I do in my book, that for him, the limit is more in terms of there's no real overlap. He sees religion as very fundamentally a private affair that can inform political choices, but that, in a sense, politics comes first, which is not surprising for someone like Darsono, I think. But at the same time, he's also very keen to express his belief that Muslim religious ideas have to be, and practices have to be supported, have to be respected, that, you know, he doesn't believe, you make it very, very clear, he doesn't believe that religion is the opiate of the masses and that the state should suppress religion as it did in Russia. So there is a variety, I think, of approaches to that question. Certainly by the time we get to the 1950s, which is also in my book, after this sort of dissolution, right, of parliament and the implementation of democracy terpimpin, you see people like Sayuti Melik and Ruslan Abdul Ghani, they start talking about how Socialisme Indonesia is fundamentally its own beast, its own animal, because it's based on religious socialism. To them, Socialisme Indonesia is very much a specific ideological formation that you cannot take Islam out of. And they say it over and over again. They give all these speeches, they write all these books, and they're very clear about that. Now, maybe that's, I mean, we can disagree. We can say that, okay, this is naive, this is optimistic, right? This is not a realistic proposition. That, I think, is a value judgment that, you know, different historians will have to make. But ultimately, I would say that on my part, I'm comfortable with the ambiguity. I'm comfortable with saying, yes, there is a limit, right, between Islam and Marxism. They exist in sort of potentially two different spheres, but there's a variety of approaches to reconciling those two things. Some people are able, like Haji Misbah, to put them together. Some people keep some distance between Islam and Marxism. I do not try in my book to make a clear statement on which is, you know, the historical objective truth, right? I simply live with the ambiguity that different people took different approaches to it. Yeah, but it's a very astute question. Thank you so much for bringing it up.
Okay, thank you, Lin. Yeah. Ijazahnya, does their background of religious organization, example as Persis or Muhammadiyah, NU, etc., also affect the reception of their talks?
Tentu
Background
saja.
of the ormas, like now ormas, organisasi masyarakat Islam seperti NU.
Yeah. Tentu saja. So it's a good thing you brought up Persis, because Persis was very, fairly conservative, right? And of course, who's that guy? I'm forgetting his name right now. This Masumi guy who was very, very conservative, very anti-communist. He took over from Ahmad Hassan as the leader of Persis in the 1950s, I believe. And you see a very interesting, I think, phenomenon during the revolution, right? So in the 1920s and 30s, you're exactly right, Iza. The Ormas kind of background definitely affected how they approached the idea of Marxism. I think, generally speaking, the Muhammadiyah people were more receptive, right? Organizations like Persis were less receptive, but that changes over time, because by the time we get to the 1950s, it is the Nadatul Ulama people who are more receptive to working with the PKI, and that's on record. That is, I'm not even looking at newspapers. I'm talking about Constitutante transcripts, parliamentary transcripts. NU is surprisingly willing to work with the PKI on at least some issues, especially land redistribution for the peasants, for the petani, right? So it does affect, but it changes over time. In the 20s and 30s, yes, there is more resistance on the part of organizations like Persis. But coming back to the revolution, which was the subject of today's talk, there is a surprising phenomenon that during the revolution, I remember the guy's name, even people like Isa Anshari, who is died in the wool, anti-communist, hates communism, hates the PKI, calls them kafir, right? even he was willing to accommodate communism during the revolution. And I think that's where Hamka's Revolusi Agama comes out of. Isa Ansari was a Persis man, right? And he had thanks Masanga, saved me there. Took me a while. Masanga is my translator, by the way. Quick digression. Masanga is one of the two translators, along with his partner, Bakriski. They are translating my manuscript into Indonesian to be published with Pustaka Pias, assuming it is still legal to publish my book in Indonesia next year. But anyway, so yes, Masanga is very familiar with the work that I've been doing. So yeah, there is this special moment during the revolution where people like Isa Ansari, where people like Hamka, right, can say, yeah, kita pun sebagai kaum Marxis, right? Because I think there is this sort of moment of optimism of, we have fought together, we have bled together, we have sacrificed so much together, right? Why can't we work together? Why can't we get along? And that doesn't last. By the time, we have the first elections in 1955, all that cooperation is gone. But there is a special moment during the revolution where people are genuinely making an honest effort to work together. Right. Okay, so I think that's it for that question.
Okay, thank you, Lin. Rifki, I think you can turn on your camera or turn your microphone to ask directly to Lin.
Can you hear me well?
Yeah.
Okay, I can hear you very well.
Mas Rifki, thank you.
Yeah, I want to ask one question that might not related to what you've been shared before, but I want to touch about the thing that you said before about the piety and also the relation between the idea of that brought by the Islamic tradition or most Abrahamic tradition also about the afterlife. So I want to ask about the intertemporal choice in relation to the idea of revolutionary idea, where that there is so called kesabaran revolutionary. So you could delay this kind of revolution because the idea of afterlife. There are some kind of movements that I also asking some people from peasant movement also that the idea of afterlife could bring some kind of defeatist attitude. Is there any kind of things that you found out in your research that we had those kind of boundaries or the perceived boundaries between this is the one that we could grasp or could grab in these lives as a revolutionary idea, but somehow the religion or the ideology out of this religion will bring some kind of this kind of ruptures or boundaries that we cannot we might be not get this revolutionary period right now because in the afterlife all of this like capitalism will be punished and another kind of things. I just want to drop this question. Thank you.
No, thank you so much, Mas Rifki. That is a really interesting question. And I have to be honest with you. My manuscript was already very long. I didn't have time to look into that. And I wasn't really looking for it, right? I was looking for sort of supporting evidence for my argument. But I do definitely see the shall we say, historical accuracy of what you are saying. There must have been people like this who recognized the injustice, who recognized the horrors of revolution and the penjajahan Belanda, tapi didn't necessarily react in the same way, right? That Ahmad Subarjo or Trimurti or Sayuti Melik did. The closest example I have to a movement that had some of these strange tendencies, shall we say, countervailing tendencies, right? That are more concerned with the afterlife, less concerned with revolutionary solidarity, labor unions, all these things. It's actually this really interesting organization called the PKI Lokal Islami, which was based in Sumatra Barat. I believe it was Padang Panjang, right, near one of the old Sumatra Tawalib schools. And it's very interesting because this organization was apparently came out of a particular, I think, a Shataria tariqat, It evolved from a Shataria Muridin Tarikat, and so, not Tarikat, but like circle. And they had some very strange ideas, and in fact were very disobedient. The TNE had to go in and arrest them and warn them and say, say one chance, okay, if you oppose us again, you better follow orders, you better get with the program, or you're going to be tangkap, we are going to put you in jail. So yeah, they had some very strange ideas about what it meant to secure independence for Indonesia. They were often a problem for the Republican authorities to deal with. For those of you who have read Audrey Cahin's book on West Sumatra during the revolution, there's actually a similar movement in Baso, I believe led by this guy called Tuanku Nan Putih and Tuanku Nan Hitam, who also, very, very Islamic, called themselves communists, but, actually basically robbing and reaving and messing up the countryside and saying, I can't remember the exact idea that they were putting forward, but I know it was very twisted. It was very like something like we will all be rewarded in the afterlife anyway, so it doesn't matter what we do in the present. All things are allowed. There's no rules anymore, right? We can steal this man's rice. We can take his farm. It doesn't matter because all justice will be done in the afterlife. So that's the closest example I have for you. You may be interested in it. So this PKI Lokal Islami, this is part of the, I think, second chapter of my book. Mas Anggal will know if I'm correct or not. I've forgotten. And if you're interested in the Baso incident with Tuanku Nan Putih and Tuanku Nan Hitam, you can find that in Audrey Cahin's Rebellion to Integration, I believe. That, if I'm not mistaken, that is the book. Yeah. So I hope that's useful for you. I think you have Sartono Kartodirjo in mind, right, when you ask this question. And it's a very interesting question, but it's unfortunately not really my field of expertise. So yeah, thank you so much for that.
Okay, thank you, Lin. This is the last question from Amiruddin Kalau. I think his question is out of context because he asks about the betrayal of intellectuals. Benda said that the duty of the scholar is to maintain morals in the context of the criminal code, which regulates punishing it and talks forbidding people from studying something like Marxist. The question is whether such rules at the same time abolish moral, and how do scholars react to rules like this? How about your opinion about the rules that abolish moral to forbidding to thinking something that constituted in this country like Marxism or communism?
So, maybe frankly, I should say first this, Amiruddin, thank you for your question. But I'm really not qualified to comment on this, but I will share something which maybe is helpful. So I think a lot of Indonesians are not familiar. I mean, Mas Rian and I were talking about this briefly before we started today. Maybe a lot of Indonesians are not familiar with Singapore's own, shall we say, uncomfortable relationship with Marxism. So before Singapore and Malaysia split, there was a sort of thriving socialist movement and also a thriving communist movement, which resulted in the Malayan emergency, right? So the Malayan Communist Party, which included Muslims, by the way, was fighting the British for independence. And in the end, they lost, and the socialists lost too. As in, the socialists weren't fighting the emergency, but they lost political power as well. And we ended up with, both in Malaysia and Singapore, governments which were, and still are, very pro-Western, and were sort of, shall we say, approved of by the British, right? So we also have a kind of a silence, a blind spot in our history and our thinking. We also have this, not to the same degree as Indonesia because of 1965, but we do have this unwillingness to talk about the past and a lack of understanding, very fundamental lack of understanding of the workers' movements, of the labor movements that were active in the 50s and 60s in Singapore and Malaysia, and which are now totally gone, right? Like you can't even start a union in Singapore, literally. So if you think the omnibus law is bad, Singapore is worse. Anyway, so I mean, you're definitely right? This to impose these kinds of criminal codes which forbids people from studying their own past, I think is frankly unreasonable and politically benefits certain people, right? Because in Indonesia, as in Singapore and Malaysia, it's very easy to win elections by saying, the communists, terrible, terrible, the enemy, and calling your enemies communists, right? Or leftists or Marxists or whatever. So, there's a lot of political benefits to be reaped. And people cannot resist using this as a tool, right? Does it have a price? Of course there is a price. It damages society. It makes us immature. It keeps us as children. Because if we don't understand our past, if we don't look at what our societies have been through to get to where we are now, how can we ever move forward with an extremely limited understanding of our past? We'll never really be able to make balanced and nuanced political decisions as citizens. And maybe that's idealistic on my part, but my answer is definitely this is not a good thing. This is a sort of abolition of moral thinking as well. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Lin. Okay, terima kasih Lin atas your presentation this evening. It's very interesting. Maybe I should read your book, and maybe our government should read your book too, so they not produce the such or same regulation like this. Okay, maybe I think this is the end of our discussion. So I will go back. I will give it this time to Mas Reza Hakim as a committee in this discussion. So Mas Reza atau Mbak Farisha. Oke, terima kasih Lin sudah mau bersamai kita. Thank you very much about your very interesting and very good presentation. Terima kasih, dan saya mohon maaf. I'm sorry, I have making this discussion is not really mengalir, tidak terlalu mengalir because my English is not really good. Tapi saya harap teman-teman bisa mendapatkan beberapa data ataupun sebuah perspektif baru bahwa Marxis itu juga sangat berpengaruh. Islam dan Marxis bisa berkolaborasi dalam konteks tertentu pada masa revolusi di Indonesia tahun 1945 hingga 1950. Terima kasih Lin, dan terima kasih Lin. Saya kembalikan ke Mbak Farisha dan Mas Reza. Terima kasih.
Terima kasih, thank you Pak Chuan. Untuk teman-teman saya mau menyebutkan kembali kalau ada buku yang akan datang dari Pak Hongxuan Lin Proletariat dari Oxford University Press. Mungkin kalau di Indonesia kita bisa beli e-booknya aja ya, tapi juga akan diterbitkan insya Allah oleh Pustaka Pias.
Pustaka Pias tuh baru lagi tuh Pak, atau saya belum pernah dengar?
Baru.
Semoga lancar penerjemahan dan penerbitannya, because the new regulation for book publishing also just dropped last February, where you have to send the whole script to the library, to the alternative for the ISBN.
Terbitkan like secara black market atau jalan-jalan tikus. Just like student activist in the order baru. Oke, terima kasih Lin.
Oke, terima kasih semuanya. Terima kasih. Saya sangat bersyukur.
Kawan-kawan.
Oke. Sampai bertemu lagi.
Terima kasih Lin. Nanti bukunya baru saya undang lagi mungkin ke universitas saya. Maybe I will invite you to my own university.
I would love to. I haven't been to Indonesia in 3 years. I would love to go back. Yeah.
Oh, you can just contact me if you go to Surabaya.
I would love to.
Okay.
Terima kasih ya, Mas
Thank you
Rian.
very much. Terima kasih.